This film is meant to be an immersive experience, powerful enough to make the case that the new transit hub and retail center at the World Trade Center should, indeed must serve a higher purpose as well, if it is to reach its true potential. A purpose that in fact clearly speaks to and highlights the practical purpose of the riveting new structure at the World Trade Center designed by the acclaimed architect Santiago Calatrava, which defines the World Trade Center even more than its other notable aspects. The building right now, as impressive as it is, lacks a soul, a defining meaning which identifies it as out of the ordinary. It is a secular, modern cathedral. Could you imagine St. Patrick's Cathedral rather just being a nameless church? It would lack an essential element that defines greatness. This new building at the World Trade Center is the first truly significant new building of the 21st century in the United States and one of the most impressive public buildings ever built. Commonly referred to colloquially as the Oculus, it demands a formal name as well, a name that is synonymous with its practical and commercial purposes and that reflects the community in which it stands and that is mindful that it is the Port Authority of both New York and New Jersey that commissioned this spectacular public building paid for with taxpayer funds, and a building that will most of all be used by New Yorkers and Jerseyites while also attracting visitors from around the world. Societies have always awarded special names to very important public buildings. It is a distinct honor, more so with a structure as noteworthy as this. Providing it a name says much about who we are, what we believe in, and what we should honor. There is only one name that uniquely qualifies in this situation: Alexander Hamilton. If you don't already know why, you will learn in the audio that accompanies this video. If you already know, then remind yourself how much this unique structure deserves to be named the Alexander Hamilton Transit Hub at the World Trade Center. At the New World Trade Center, the Oculus deserves a purposeful name and also to honor a great American. That name, an individual that singularly is appropriate in this case, would be Alexander Hamilton. This is the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, of course, 6 commissioners from New York, 6 from New Jersey. A very timely article in Asbury Park Press. There was a banner story, Hamilton's ties to New Jersey run deep. Hamilton's record in New Jersey is impressive, as it is in New York. During the early stages of the Revolutionary War, the young officer Alexander Hamilton was heroic in battle in New Jersey. While in New Jersey, he became the most important aide-de-camp to George Washington. And as of course we all know, his demise took place in New Jersey. But as importantly, Paterson, New Jersey exists because of Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton created Paterson, New Jersey, which did not exist, in order to prove the brilliant economic concepts that he believed the nation should be built on could work. And he created something called the Society for Establishing Useful Manufacturers. In a notable study about those early years, it's called SUM in short. Through SUM, Alexander Hamilton attempted to create and unite a weak and fledgling United States by strengthening the nation politically and economically. The society was Hamilton's first attempt to bind the nation together through the interdependence of economic affairs, attempting to give the nations its first true common interest that would help all the people, regardless of region or class, and he did that in Paterson, New Jersey. Let me sum up by making the most important point of all. in favor of Alexander Hamilton, who is physically buried within sight of the World Trade Center. Had it not been, I can't say this often enough, had it not been for September 11, 1789, we would not be here today. On that day, Alexander Hamilton was nominated by President Washington, approved by the Senate, and sworn in as the first Secretary of the Treasury. As brilliant as all the other founding fathers were, they did not have a clue how to fund this young government. The Articles of Confederation had failed. The Constitution would have failed, and we would be South America today, a bunch of little countries. Alexander Hamilton understood, as no one in human history had, that you could fund a new nation based on nothing but the promise of that country. And the bonds that he created to do that were not only sold well within the United States, but worldwide. We exist here today because of Alexander Hamilton, and I think it would be most appropriate that we have the Alexander Hamilton Transit Hub at the World Trade Center. I think you will all make yourselves proud and all of us proud by making that decision. Thank you.
In his report on manufacturers, Hamilton talks about what manufacturing and economic diversity can do for people. And he wrote what I consider to be the most eloquent, the most moving words he ever wrote. He said that minds of the strongest and most active nature can fall below mediocrity and labor without effect if confined to uncongenial pursuits. But where all the different kinds of industry obtain in a community, each individual can find his proper element and call into activity the full vigor of his nature. Each individual can find his proper element and call into activity the whole vigor of his nature. Hamilton is going beyond dollars and cents. He's even going beyond diversity. He's looking at an economy's effect on people. I find this moving because he's writing about himself. But unlike some people who rise from nowhere and make it, he thought of other Alexander Hamiltons. He wanted to make a world that would be easier and better for them. That's what he wanted the American economy to be. That's what he was trying to create.
He often chose the nation's well-being over his physical, financial, and family's well-being. Who tells your story? We are most privileged to have Richard Brookhiser tell the story. Alexander Hamilton, the man who made America, Richard Brookhiser.
So how did Hamilton make America prosperous? I think we have to look at three things. We have to look at the arc of his life, where he came from and where he went. And then we have to review what he did at the height of his life. And then we have to consider what inspired him, what most moved him. Hamilton, as you know, was an immigrant, and Hamilton was the unique immigrant from the West Indies. Born on the island of Nevis, raised on the island of St. Croix, which is in the Virgin Islands. And the West Indies in Hamilton's lifetime, the late 18th century, was like the Middle East today. It was the place where the thing that everyone wanted came from. Today that's oil. In the 18th century that was sugar. The wealth that was generated by West Indian sugar was fantastic. Hamilton saw the commerce that was generated from the ground up. His first job in Christiansted in St. Croix was for a merchant house called Beekman and Kruger. It was headquartered in New York City. It had branches in the West Indies and another branch in Bristol, England. Hamilton was not bound for Parliament. He was a clerk in a store. But he saw from the bottom, from the ground up, how trading was done, how money circulated, how deals were made. He also saw the enormous disparities in the holding of this wealth. Most of this money went to planters. Many of them didn't even live in the islands where their plantations were. But the vast bulk of the population was slaves. The population of Nevis, when Hamilton lived there, was 10,000 slaves, 500 white people. The population of St. Croix was 22,000 slaves, 2,000 white people. The average lifespan of a field hand who was brought to the West Indies from Africa was 7 years before he was worked to death or before he died of diseases. But the planters were not so concerned with that because there was always another slave ship coming in. When Hamilton lived in Nevis, he lived just down the street from a large pen where the slaves fresh from Africa were held before they were sorted out and put on smaller ships and sent throughout the west of the British West Indies. So this was the social system that Hamilton grew up in. Heavily skewed, no opportunity to rise. He managed to get out because of his own brilliance and because of his luck. He was a very smart boy and a smart young man. His employers recognized that. So did the local minister in Christiansted, a man named Hugh Knox. He had connections in the North American mainland. So when Hamilton was a teenager, he was sent to North America to be educated. And the first plan was to send him to the College of New Jersey, which is now Princeton. That didn't work. So he went to King's College, which is now Columbia, and which was then just up Broadway from this building. This is the second important location in Hamilton's life. The fact that he came here to New York rather than to Philadelphia or to Boston, which were the other significant cities in British North America. Philadelphia was the largest. New York had passed Boston to become second, was gaining on Philadelphia. And they were all commercial cities. But Boston and Philadelphia had been founded as holy cities. They were religious experiments. Boston was the city on the hill. Philadelphia was the city of brotherly love. And some of that atmosphere still clung to them. But New York was always and only about getting and spending. The Dutch had founded it as New Amsterdam, as a trading post. After the Constitution was ratified, George Washington had to pick a first Treasury Secretary. So he recommended Alexander Hamilton, saying that he was damned sharp. Washington knew that already. Hamilton had been on his staff. So he becomes the first Treasury Secretary of the United States, September 1789, when he's 32 years old. And now we come to what he did at the climax of his life. And the problem that he faced was debt. Wars cost money, and the United States had no money. We had gone through the war, 8.5-year war, the longest war we ever fought until Vietnam. It was longer than the Civil War and our portion of World War II put together. But we couldn't pay for it. The government under the Continental Congress and the Articles of Confederation could not tax the states. They could ask the states for money. And if the states wouldn't pay or couldn't pay, they didn't have to pay. Robert Morris said at one point that asking the states for money was like preaching to the dead. So what did Hamilton do? He had going for him the fact that the new Constitution did allow the federal government to raise taxes. So that was a plus. But how would the money be spent? He made two early decisions of great consequence. One was called assumption, the other was called non-discrimination. Assumption had to do with the fact that there was not one American debt, but there were 14. There were the debts owed by the United States, and there were the debts owed by each of the 13 states. The 13 states had raised their own troops, they'd made their own expenses in the war, and some of them were badly in arrears, Massachusetts in particular, and also South Carolina. And there was ill feeling among the states because some of the states had paid off their debts, and they thought, well, why should we take on obligations by the deadbeat states? Hamilton's argument was that the war had been a common struggle. All the states were fighting together for the liberty of all, for the whole country. So he assumed the debts of the 13 states along with the federal debt. They would all be treated as one debt. They would be paid off at the same time. This was the decision for assumption. Non-discrimination had to do with the creditors, the holders of the debt. Most of them were soldiers who had not been paid during the war. This was simply chronic. Soldiers were not paid. They were given IOUs, and at the end of the war, they were sent home with their IOUs, promises of future payment. But over the years, some of these IOUs have been sold. If a soldier needed money immediately, he might sell his IOU at a discount to a merchant. Or maybe he would sell it to a speculator, to someone with resources who thought, well, maybe one day these things will be paid off. Let me buy them up from soldiers. So the IOUs had been traded. Everyone agreed that soldiers should be paid off at their full value. These men had suffered for the country. They had fought, they had bled. But many Americans felt, why should we pay off speculators? They haven't fought, they haven't bled. They were simply looking for a profit. Hamilton knew the way the world of money works. He knew that if debtors pick and choose among their creditors, they can do it once. They won't be able to get a loan again, or if they can, it will be at punishing rates of interest. So he said there should be non-discrimination, that all the creditors will be paid off at a common rate. And he was able to get Congress to agree to this too. Now he had to do some bargaining to make this happen. The most consequential deal was to move the capital of the United States from New York, where it was then sitting, first to Philadelphia for 10 years, and then to a site in the Potomac, which was as yet undeveloped, is now Washington, D.C. So we incurred a future of murderous Washington summers, but we got America's debts paid off in a timely fashion. And that was due to Hamilton's foresight and his clever deal making. He also had an insight about how to handle the debt. His intention was not to pay it off and make it go away. He wanted to manage the debt. He wanted a debt where regular payments would be made on the interest. And his insight was that if you did that with debt, it turns from being a liability into being a resource. People see that you're not struggling under a burden, you're maintaining it. So they're willing to extend you credit. Debt becomes credit. Debt can become money. A debt has to be managed carefully, and that was Hamilton's intention. His way of managing the debt was a new thing in world finance. Only two countries had gone this route. Holland was the first at the end of the 17th century. England followed with the Bank of England. So Alexander Hamilton was going to take this country, this small country on the edge of nowhere, and make it the third country in the world, in the new world of modern finance. And there were going to be many bumps on the road after his death. People did not maintain his policies. We would have panics and we would have depressions. But he got us off to a solid start. When he came in as Treasury Secretary, as I said, our debt was trading at a quarter to a third of its value. When he left, it was trading at 110% of his value. He had made it worth as good as gold, so the money men of Europe were willing to pay a small premium to hold it. The phrase we use for poor, troubled new nations is banana republic, because most of them are in countries where bananas grow. But America was on the way to being one of those countries. If Hamilton had not lived and served, the phrase for a troubled new nation would be Maple Republic or Pine Republic, because we would have been the first one. He helped us to avoid that fate. But he wasn't doing it only to balance the books. He wasn't even doing it to expand the economy. He had a further vision in mind, and that's what I want to end with. We can see it in his report on manufacturers. The Alexander Hamilton Awareness Society had an event at the Great Falls in Paterson, the Falls of the Passaic, where the Passaic River drops 50 feet on its way to the Atlantic. And Hamilton saw that during the war. He had a picnic there with George Washington and Lafayette. And he saw this is a source for power. This can be used for factories. But factories did come to Paterson, and they did come to America. And in a report that Hamilton issued to Congress, he talked about the benefits of a diverse economy to the United States. He said, we have agriculture, we have commerce and trade, but we also need manufacturing. We need all we can get. And he went into great detail about the kinds of things that could be made in America. But in his report on manufacturers, Hamilton talks about what manufacturing and economic diversity can do for people. And he wrote what I consider to be the most eloquent, the most moving words he ever wrote. He said that minds of the strongest and most active nature can fall below mediocrity and labor without effect if confined to uncongenial pursuits. But where all the different kinds of industry obtain in a community, each individual can find his proper element and call into activity the full vigor of his nature. Each individual can find his proper element and call into activity the whole vigor of his nature. Hamilton is going beyond dollars and cents. He's even going beyond diversity. He's looking at an economy's effect on people. I find this moving because he's writing about himself. He could so easily have fallen below mediocrity and labored without effect. But unlike some people who rise from nowhere and make it, he thought of other Alexander Hamiltons. He wanted to make a world that would be easier and better for them. That's what he wanted the American economy to be. That's what he was trying to create. Now, we are here to celebrate his life, but we are also commemorating, we've been calling it his passing, but let's be honest, his death. His death in a duel, which I believe was needless, I believe was tragic. It makes me angry with him whenever I consider it. I remember the first time I went to Weehawken, where many of you have been. And the dueling site is long gone. It was a ledge over the Hudson about 20 feet up from the water, and it was dynamited in the 19th century to put in a railroad. So now at the top of the cliff, they have a tiny little park. It's not much bigger than this lectern. They have a rock against which Hamilton is said to have leaned after he was shot, and there's a flagpole and there's a fence. And there really isn't much to see there. But what there is to see is across the water, because it's right on the Hudson. And when you look to the east, you see all of Manhattan, from the Battery all the way up through Midtown, all the way up to Riverside Church, the Manhattan mountain range of skyscrapers and apartment buildings. And I knew that if Hamilton could see that now, he would say, this is why I came here. This is what I work to build. Use it. Thanks very much.
Richard Brookhiser has just very well highlighted the logic for the Alexander Hamilton Transit Hub by focusing on Hamilton's ultimate and unique accomplishment that separates him from all the other founders, while only touching on the much wider arc of Hamilton's life and achievements. But it was indeed Hamilton's vision for America, created by him right here in Lower Manhattan, within sight of today's World Trade Center, and Hamilton's vision of New Jersey as a prime testbed for the future of capitalism that is more than enough to merit the naming of the new transit hub in Hamilton's honor. Alexander Hamilton remains the only one of the greatest Americans without an adequate national monument. This new structure at the World Trade Center serves this purpose perfectly, even more that Hamilton is being widely embraced as the American founder for the 21st century. The new transit hub is a symbol of our future, different than the traditional monuments, classic structures built of stone like those for Washington, Lincoln, and others that have a very traditional design and have no practical purpose. The transit center as a monument is very much of our time. It is what Alexander Hamilton so very richly deserves from us as a symbol of America today and tomorrow, locally and globally.